like to thank George and the staff here for making this possible.
And
I'd like to thank Elizabeth for inviting me to participate as well.
I was going to do that.
Yeah.
I was going to thank George and his staff.
Well, go ahead.
And I will. Like, you can be thanked more than once, that's for sure. Everybody appreciates that. I also want to thank Steve Lloyd, who's our videographer. Thanks for coming.
How it progressed.
Yeah.
As a medium for you.
You know, and Dolores asked me this earlier, and I think the truth is, I went to Cass Tech. So for any of you who know about Cass Tech or have heard about Cass, a lot of what they said about it is true, say about it is true. You really, and I was in commercial art, as a matter of fact, but I took a lot of ceramics classes, and I was good at it. I was a thrower, and I was good at it, and especially at that age, I enjoyed doing what I was good at, right? And then I ended up majoring in it as an undergrad, but I was a thrower. Mm-hmm. And over the years, I moved away from it because I just didn't have the equipment. I hadn't figured out how to be a potter. And that's what what I associated with ceramics was being a potter. And it wasn't till, so there was a long interval that I wasn't doing clay at all. And there was one brief scenario or brief episode when I did a residency that I started to work in the ceramic studio again. And all I did was throw, and that was some of the least interesting work that I had done, that I did that year and a half that I was there. I kind of couldn't break away from this notion of throwing. So this is a real departure, and we can kind of talk about how I got to using clay this way. Mm-hmm. I barely call it ceramics because there's so little clay.
Right, right. Well, what's interesting, you know, you talk about throwing, and yet some of the forms that you have, both in your drawings and in the pieces, could easily be small thrown forms. It's almost as if you are reducing the thrown forms to the lines that form around, that form in the clay as you throw.
You know, it's funny you should say that. They could be. And it's funny you should say that because, and you haven't even seen these, and I don't think you know about these even. I have started a series of small forms, and I work in porcelain mostly because I really am into that, you know, really fine wall, and I just love the feel of porcelain. It doesn't have any grog in it, for those of you who know anything about clay. So it's really just buttery in your fingers, you know, between your fingers. And so I've started this series of little tiny forms, as thin as I can get them.
You're throwing again?
Well, the first ones are thrown, but I don't have a wheel, so okay. I've got a plan, I've got a pattern and everything to do some hand-constructed ones. Mm-hmm. I haven't done any of those, but I'm mimicking a thrown one that I did that cracked. It was a beautiful little form, but it cracked. Mm-hmm. So I'm annoyed about that, but I'm gonna, you know, as a person working in clay, I guess you have to get over that one.
Right, right, very quickly.
Really quickly. So, so that's the plan. But it's funny that you should mention that. I hadn't thought about it that way. I really hadn't thought about that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's why I'm having the conversation with her.
Now, looking at your drawings, you know, I can see your hand in the drawings, and somehow you have captured that same quality using the nichrome wire. And for those of you who may not be familiar with nichrome wire, it's in your toaster. It's a wire it's resistive, and so it glows and gets hot, and depending on the gauge, it'll break or it won't. But sometimes it's used to support ceramic pieces and ceramic work because it can withstand heat. Now, what I find really fascinating, Elizabeth, is that you're not using it in that way. You're using it the same way you use line in your drawings.
Exactly. And I've been doing these drawings for, it must be close to 10 years now, but I had maybe about 4 years ago, I had this notion, because I don't sleep much, but I don't get up when I wake up. So I'd lay there sometimes, well, almost all the time, for an hour or so, and I'm real productive. My imagination is real productive about 4 in the morning. And I mean, honestly, you know, that's really valuable time for me. And in fact, now I don't get up that time, because I could. I'm not sleepy, so I could get up. I had this notion of trying to make the drawings three-dimensional, and I kept thinking about it, and I knew that I needed to somehow hold line and space and hold it together, and that's where my ceramics background kicked in again, because I realized, and I conceive of these as pinning lines together. You know, I use the clay to pin the lines together. So anyway, that's how that happened. And there's kind of a range of the work. Some use kind of just the minimal amount of clay to hold them together, and some pieces use more than the minimum to hold it together. But that's kind of what those are about. I think of them as three-dimensional drawings, or the drawings in space somehow.
I also think it's really interesting the way you get the clay to appear like beads on the wire. That adds little junction points for a person's visual exploration of the forms that are defined. How do you do that?
That was a really happy accident. One of the first ones. When this clay is in liquid form, it's called slip. I discovered this at CCS, and they have this beautiful big tub of slip for casting. And there's a nozzle, a hose and a nozzle, just like at the filling station. And you hold this nozzle, squeeze this nozzle, and the slip comes pouring out, just like gasoline does. I was trying to add some slip to kind of the body of the clay, the part that kind of holds...
That holds the clay together.
Yeah, that holds the wire together. And I lost control of it. I kind of didn't expect it to come out in that strong a stream, and it wet, essentially, the wire. And it just it adhered to the wire, and it beat it up in certain places. It didn't coat the wire, but it actually beat it up in certain spots. And it was kind of an interesting surprise. And now I try to use it sparingly, because it's a little gimmicky, you know, if you use it too much. But it was a nice way to punctuate the line. And in the drawings, the line will be broken with dots, so there's kind of an equivalency there, a relationship there, a similarity of a line and a circular element.
Another thing that happens, you know, I have a ceramics background as well, and I know that you can learn to control clay and you can predict the results you get with glazes. But in the case of wire, what happens? I mean, you know, once that kiln door is closed, there's nothing you can do.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I named the show Vicissitude, and I should give credit for this. I was listening to I think he was a writer or a poet, and they were talking about, I think the quote would be that light is subject, or color is subject to the vagaries and vicissitudes of light. And that really struck me, and I think vagaries and vicissitudes they both play a big part. That's what happens when the kiln door closes. The wire has a memory of its own when it comes off the spool, and so you have to kind of manage it and hold it in place. But as soon as it starts to fire, or once it comes out, because I don't really know where in the process it changes, the wire sets, and it takes on the form that it was in once it started to fire. But it also is subject to weight. So if you, for instance, that kind of circular piece that comes off the wall, initially it was suspended so that it literally hung, so that the clay was on essentially a bar that hung down. Well, the loops of the wire were such that they literally sagged in the kill, so they weren't circular. They were oval
okay.
at that point. The fire piece on the end back there, you'll see the curve and the bend in that wire. The piece of the clay was literally was parallel and sat on the shelf, and the wires went up into the air. The heat within the kiln caused the weight of the wire to sag. And so that's how you get that's what happens with the kind of gentle curve that's in the wire. Now, the other thing that's interesting about it is the wire stays pliable, which is interesting. So I can, with a little more heft than I usually expect that it takes, I can reform that wire. Now, I can't get out every single crimp, or maybe I could. I haven't tried to get out every single crimp, but you can reform the wire.
So that's how you got that back into a circle.
Back into a circle,
from
yeah.
the oval. Now, when you go to build these, obviously you have to use an armature or something, correct? You have to support the wire somehow in an effort to control it.
Right, and it kind of depends on the size of the piece, because if they're small enough, you can just kind of you can hold it with you can clamp it with. I've used hair clips, and if you wanted one of those spiral curls, you got this little clip and you spiral up your hair. Anyway, I've used those. I've made tools. I'll use two slats of wood and clamp them on the end. So it kind of depends on how big the arc it is, and whether you want it to be an arc. Sometimes I'll wrap it around something that's rectangular or square, because everything burns away in the kiln, of course, except for the wire and the clay, because these things fire at 2,200 degrees, in that range. Usually they're wrapped around something, but if they're large enough, and I'm trying to scale them up to kind of see what else they'll do.
Now, do you think that you could have done this kind of work immediately after graduate school at Cranbrook?
Heck no. I got better. What Doris is alluding to is my lack of patience as a younger person. I needed things to be done quickly. And I was getting better at it, because that's where I had done a little bit of weaving before Cranbrook, but it was there that I really learned how to weave and how to read patterns and draft patterns and tie a balloon, appropriately. And so I had gotten a little bit better, but I couldn't do things that, as kind of fine as this. And when I weave now, I'm interested in things that are 20 ends per inch, in an inch you'd have 20 threads, and you have to handle each thread. So I can do that now. Probably not until 10, 15 years ago, maybe. And it's funny, because this work, the drawing started kind of as substitution work. I was talking to somebody, and they talked about the idea of substitution work, when you didn't have the space or the equipment or the money or the whatever it took to do the work you actually wanted to do, but you knew you needed to keep working and you wanted to keep working, so you came up with what they called substitution work.
Ah, okay.
And I can't exactly remember what it was I wanted to do, but I started doing these drawings as kind of substitution work, and they sort of took over. They became the major work for a while, and now the clay and the drawings kind of work together. They're both major.
I really enjoy the quality of the line, both in the drawings and in the three-dimensional forms. How do you consistently get the line you get in the drawings, and what are you thinking about as you're doing that?
Well, I'd say there are two different answers to that, especially for the drawings. The drawings have to do with this notion of repetition and repeating and reconsidering a single idea. And in the case of the drawings, it started out as the idea of the line represented reconsidering the same thought. So if you say you have a problem that you're trying to solve, You think about it one way, then you think about it another way, and you keep addressing it, and it keeps changing, and you know, new information comes to you, and which is kind of what vicissitude is about, change. So things, they keep getting a little bit different, and you could think of it as a knot, kind of teasing out a knot. It gets a little bit looser and a little bit looser. So the drawings, the lines initially were about repeating the same line.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course you can't repeat the same line. It's like being the same person. You're not really the same person that you were yesterday. You know, you're a little bit different. And of course, you're a very different person in 10 years. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like that. But as I was trying to repeat this line, it was controlled or affected, the line was affected by the arc of my wrist. You know, the drawing that I would do quite often because I'd anchor my wrist. Then they got more physical. As I got bigger, it got more physical, and that is also controlled by what my body can do and how I can control my body. And this one was a real interesting one because it has to do with walking.
I was going to say, did you do that one standing up?
Yep. And because I had this interest to do these walking drawings. And I think that's related to weaving, because weaving is, oh, I didn't mention that. Yeah, I did, weaving.
Yeah.
Because weaving is really physical. Mm-hmm. If you've ever woven yardage, it's rhythmic, because you know, you're weaving, especially if you're putting in, unless you're doing something really, really fat, you know, it takes 20, 30, 40 passes of the shuttle to get an inch or two of cloth. So once you start weaving, I mean, it's real physical. It's just back and forth, and you're moving treadles, and you pull the beater bar, and you throw the shuttle, and you hit the treadle, and you pull the beater bar. So it's that repetition over and over. So I was interested in trying to get some of that physicality into the drawings. And so sometimes, you know, the walking in the straight is, in some ways it's easier than those that where the lines are not straight, because it's a little bit harder to control, but then they're sort of a combination of the straight walking lines, as I call them, mm-hmm. and those that are kind of anchored by your wrist, mm-hmm. you know, and control, or maybe it's your elbow that you use, or sometimes I'll give myself a few guidelines so that I know I'm trying to stay within the lines, you know, because you can see it on these, and
right.
I'm a person that likes process to show, so I left them there. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I'd remove them, so they're kind of an interesting combination of following the line that I did before and trying to pay some attention to form that I'm creating. Okay. You know, a form that's not the plinth. You know, mm-hmm. the cone and the plinth that I've been using.
So how do you resolve, you know, in my drawings that are done with thread on paper, the front surface is what I refer to as the intentional mark, because I can see it as I'm making it. But the back of the paper is the unintentional mark. Right. I have no control over that. That's the equivalent of your work in the kiln. How do you resolve the two?
You just don't pay attention to it. You could, anyway, control freak, you can control it if you want.
So how are you struck? Are there pieces that you completely give up on, or how do you decide which one is worthy of being in an exhibition? How do you keep the good ones? What are the good ones? What do you do with the failures?
The failures, yeah, it varies. This is a good one, example. Mm-hmm. The way that I get the clay to hold together and to get onto the wire and not beat up like the way it does over there is that I have to use some kind of substrate in the clay. I have to soak whatever with the clay, or I have to coat ribbon or cat hair or fabric or various things that I come up with. I have to coat it with the clay, and then I have to apply that clay-soaked fabric or fiber to the wire. Well, sometimes it soaks all the way in, mm-hmm. and then it becomes this, solid clay form, and the hair or the ribbon or whatever burns away. But in the case of this one, the clay did not saturate the ribbon, which really surprised me. It was grosgrain ribbon. You guys know what the grosgrain ribbon is. Well, apparently, this is my theory, my diagnosis, that the grosgrain is such a tight weave that I would literally have to work the clay into the ribbon. It literally just coated the ribbon so that when it fired, the fiber burned away and the clay was hollow, because the ribbon had inhabited the interior of that space.
Right.
And so the clay was thin enough that in some places the clay broke away. It wasn't solid enough to hold together. And that's part of what happens too. The clay shrinks, porcelain shrinks more than some other bodies do, and you get this kind of breakage and cracking because it's interesting. The wire doesn't move. The wire doesn't shrink, and so something has to give, and quite often you end up with these cracks. And so the question is how much can it crack and still have integrity? And it's important to me that it has integrity because I come out of the functional throwing background and just kind of the way that I learned to make stuff as a kid with the adults that were around me. You made stuff and it was supposed to hold together. Now there's another kind of art where things do change over time, and that's valid and interesting too, but that's not what these are for me.
In your artist statement, you talk about memory, and you also talk about loss. How does that relate to your work?
I talked about the things that are that I dip in the clay. Let me back up even further. I'm kind of sentimental, and I like to hold on to things of my own, but also of my mother's in this case. And my mother passed away and I inherited the house and the furniture and all that. And you know what drawers are like. And everybody's got a drawer in their dresser that had all the little pieces in it. The single shoestring and the hair, bobby pins. And those of you who know me know I have no use for bobby pins and those little clips that I talked about. And things like that. So I had all this stuff that I didn't want to just chuck in the trash. And then I moved in my stuff, and then I left my studio. So I kept moving stuff in the house and moving stuff in the house. And I had this house full of stuff, with way too much stuff. And I had to kind of ferret my way through it and decide, some stuff had to go. Just to make it long story short. When I started needing stuff to put in the clay, I found a way I thought, well, maybe I'll try using some of these things that are around the house. Oh, because my mother also sewed and knitted. And so so she had a bunch of fabric and, patterns things that had been cut out that hadn't been sewn. And there was fabric there's yarn, believe me. If anybody wants yarn, see me. I just finished sorting it out by color and type. Plus there was my stuff. And I have cats, and they have, one is a long-haired cat, and I keep him combed fairly regularly, so there's always nice clumps of hair, coming out off of Zero, that's his name. The memory part has to do with choosing and using these things around the house. And they're there because it's not just the loss of my mother, it's loss of what happens over time. You don't have yesterday. So it's not necessarily a sad loss, it's just loss about change, and it's different. And these are some of these things are things that I want to have a way to keep as well. I had a nightgown. It was just a beautiful nightgown. And it was just a cotton nightgown, but I had worn it so long that it literally tore. And this was a big, loose nightgown, but it got threadbare. That's what actually happened.
Right.
And so it tore. And I thought, God, Elizabeth, you got all this stuff in this house. You do not need to sew up this tear in this nightgown. Let it go. And as I was putting it in the trash, literally in the wastebasket, I saw how beautifully it was sewn. You know, the seams were flat felled seams, and you know, the little bit of lace around it was so nicely done. And I thought, you know, I'm going to dip this in clay and see what this looks like. But I have no interest in it being real recognizable.
Right.
So that's a piece that didn't make it into the show because I'm debating still whether it's too referential.
Oh, okay.
You know,
okay.
you know, you could, if I pointed out to you, or if you looked at that, you might be able to recognize the texture as grosgrain ribbon, but you probably wouldn't. You might now that I mentioned it. But in most of these pieces, you wouldn't be able to say, oh, she used cat hair, you know, to clump that clay up, or she used a piece of fabric for that one, because it's for some reason to me it's important that it the overall form itself transcend the individual parts. And for me, part of that is that you're not looking at it going, oh, I know that's a that, and that's a that, and that's a that. You know, it's not, and to my mind, it helps it all work together as one unit.
Good,
Well,
good. Would you feel comfortable opening up questions to the audience? I think if any of you
Absolutely.
have any questions or comments.
Absolutely.
Jeff?
There's an artist who wraps things with thread, and she'll actually put things from her life into it. Are you doing something like that, or is it more functional?
The answer is yes, I am. And initially it was functional, but it became a way to order this stuff around me. It became a way to use them, to kind of preserve them, and to make sense of my space. Even though I wasn't thinking about it. I mean, if you took all this clay and put it together, it's not saving me much. It's not clearing up much space, but think of it as psychological space,
Right.
maybe.
Right.
You need to work bigger.
You know, I'm trying to work bigger, but that becomes a functional problem in terms of mass of the clay. Because I had a big piece like this, but you got to get the clay thick enough to be able to be handled, but I'm working on it.
Okay. I wanted to know what came first, the drawings or the sculpture?
The drawings, for
Oh,
sure.
Okay. And did they influence you on your clay then?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I consider them
I thought-
three-dimensional drawings.
Maybe I missed it because I was a little late, sorry.
It's okay.
And then I'm not familiar with the ribbon that you referred to. What is the,
Grosgrain ribbon, how can I just, would it show up on sailor pants? It's got a rib in it. If you, midi blouses, am I dating myself? Sailor blouses and stuff, when there's ribbon on it.
is that a little texture to it?
Yeah, and it's a rib. Yeah, it's a rib, the
It's a-
ribbon
it's a
runs this way.
Vertical line ribbon.
No, it's a short horizontal rib.
I'm just drawing a blank.
It goes back and forth. You know, there's satin ribbon, and it's smooth. The other ribbon that typically you will see is the grosgrain ribbon, where the ribbon is running this way, and there's little ribs that run across it. And it's all a function. Go to Haberman's or somewhere, you'll see, when you see ribbon, there's kind of only two kinds anymore.
Yeah.
You probably do.
Yeah. And it's fairly stiff. It's fairly stiff. It's not pliable and soft like satin ribbon.
Like satin, yeah, it wouldn't
Yeah.
fall the way. Different
Right.
hand, it's
Right.
called.
Nobody else?
No, it takes a while to come up with a question.
Oh, wait.
What would my suggestion be for a young artist? Keep at it. Keep at it. You know, when they tell you to do it every day, you know, the mic just went away from Jide. Jide could address that. He's an artist right here in the front. I was talking to him over the holiday, and you know, I said, well, what are you doing today? He said, I'm working. I take this time to work. He works every day, and I've taken breaks. I've taken big breaks in between because I made my living as a designer, and I see it as I bought myself time to make this work now. But now that I'm making this work, I think, boy, oh boy, I wish I hadn't taken those breaks. You know, I mean, you can do what you can do, and I was busy doing other things that were useful and important. But that's what I would tell a young person. If you want to do it, find a way to keep doing it. When you graduate, get yourself a place to work, whether it's a place in your house or a place outside of your house. Stay immersed in it. Keep looking, go look at work. Cultivate a community of friends that are working, because it's kind of helps to work if you know other people that are doing it. Mm-hmm. You can talk to each other and support each other. And so whether you're actually physically making work, you're still kind of making work because you're thinking and you're looking and you're synthesizing. So just kind of steady on every day. I mean, don't look for the big show or the big. Just kind of steady on every day, and then boom, you got something. It's like you bump into something, like, whoa, I got a thing, and it's real. It's a real piece of art this time. That's how at least it works for me.
And I have to thank Elizabeth, because she introduced me to Teresita Fernandez, who's an artist who became a MacArthur. She got a MacArthur Genius Award. She gave a commencement speech, which you can find online, and it's worth listening to. Teresita, Teresita Fernandez,
Can I send you the link and you can put it on your site and people can find it?
Fernandez.
Dolores, they can put it on their site. I can send
Okay.
it to them.
Okay.
And Anamdi will post it, and you can find the link on their
Okay.
site.
And then we have one more question.
Okay.
Well, I just have a quick question about the pink, actually. Did you select that color?
No, that's the galleries.
Okay.
choice.
So did you think that was successful?
It's okay with me.
Okay.
It's not okay with everybody, I know, but it's okay with me.
I like it, actually. I was
Okay, but the commencement address is one of the most sensible commencement addresses for art students I have ever heard. And one of the important things she says to these graduates is that your life feeds your art. So all of your life experiences are going to flow into that. And the more experiences you have, the better the art is. So often, I think when I remember graduating from college thinking I was going to make great art, but I didn't even know what my thing was. And when in the 70s, when I was at Wayne, it was do your own thing. And here I was coming out of a parochial school education going, thing, what's my thing? I don't know what my thing is. So how could I make anything? I returned to studio practice in 2009 after a 30-year hiatus. And boy, do I know what my thing is, and do I have a lot of work to make, and a lot of ideas. It's like they just don't stop. It's almost like I look at the calendar and I see where my birth date is and I go, I don't know if I have enough time to finish all the ideas I've got. So and that's one of the points she makes. Who you love, how you love them, what you do, how you do it, everything feeds your art. So, there was a period where I thought I wasn't making art, but I was writing about art, or I was supporting artists, or I was buying art, or I was, encouraging my daughter to be an artist, or I was cooking and entertaining in a way that became my expression, and that was my art. Mm-hmm. And now I'm channeling all that back into my studio.
Can I say one more thing to that? Look around you. There are a lot of artists here. And in fact, I'm going to ask all the artists to raise their hands. Please, don't be shy. And that's all sorts of artists. People who cook, people who sew. So there are, and I ask people to raise their hands. So if any young people are here or any people who think they want to make art, you could talk to any one of these people. And we're talking musicians, mm-hmm. We're talking visual artists. There are people here who can attest to that idea of steady on, mm-hmm. and how different it is at the beginning than it is 20 or 30 years later. Mm-hmm. And there are young artists here as well. Mm-hmm. So, I think you can get their opinions, I'll put it that way.
And I think one of the interesting things is that art is thought about differently now. When I was at Wayne, I was just hearing about dead white men's art. or big, high-priced artists in New York, and very few of them were women. Now, however, and it was largely through going to African American galleries here in Detroit that I found that those artists involved their families in their openings so that everybody was there. It was like going to church, and they introduced everybody. Whereas when I went to openings at galleries that were owned by white business people, it was, the artist was the focus, and as far as I knew, that person lived in a bubble and had no family, and I didn't even know how they got where they were. My illusion was that they lived in a studio and just made art all day. I didn't even think about how they paid their bills. And in fact, that's not what happens. And I think it's important that artists know that's, especially young people know. And that's another point that Teresita Fernandez makes, and that is that you don't have to give anything up. I just loved it when she said, I had babies, I traveled, I made art, and I have many ideas, and I'm going to keep doing it. And that's really important. Sometimes, and I've read about African American women artists who literally had a 2-foot space on the end of their kitchen table, and that's where they made their art. And it was terrific. And they got support. And they did it while the soup was cooking and the baby was crawling under the table. That's the way you do it. Or, guys who worked in the garage, because you don't have to have a studio away from home, but at some point in your career, if you can, it gives you a different perspective if you can leave home and you can leave the laundry and you can leave the car in the garage in the winter and you work somewhere else. But you can't give up. You still have to keep at it.
Are there more questions back there? Yep.
Hi, this question was, my name is Julian J, by the way. This question was brought about by the previous one about experiences being very helpful, actually, probably being fundamental to
Yeah, kind
the
of.
creation of art, at least seriously. The other thing, of course, being time or commitment. Could you address, and this comes from an earlier interview that myself and yourself had, which you'll probably read about, I'm sure, within the next few months on an online magazine. But could you address the influences, if any, of your profession as a graphic designer in the current body of work?
Oh.
Could you
Since-
hash that out a bit?
Ever since you asked me that, I've been kind of wrestling with that. Because my graphic design influence were definitely modernist. The Swiss designers and, George Nelson and the way that got transferred over here. George Nelson and Massimo Vignelli, and those people. And they it's sort of a mashup with minimalism in terms of art. I sort of gravitated to that, and that was strictly because of the way that it looked. I always think that I should know more about minimalism than I do, formally than I do even still. But I think just aesthetically, visually, I was drawn to that. And I think maybe you're alluding to this notion that I've always understood space. I've kind of always never had a problem, even in I think high school is probably where I started doing it, looking at commercial art, which is what they called graphic design way back then. Even those compositions had lots of negative space in them. And I think that had to do with my mother's taste. My mother was, a person who, she sewed and she made a lot of our clothes. She made even more of hers. And it was the choice in patterns and the choice in fabrics and what was around our house. She was very much influenced by, Eastern, Japanese and Chinese art, so we had mountainscapes with lots of that negative space in them. And so, that's kind of the way that I sort of teased it out. I don't know if that's the truth of it, but I sort of always related to a certain amount of restraint. For instance, I've never done exuberant color the way a lot of people do. And I'll leave it at that. Does that respond
Yes.
to your question?
Since you mentioned minimalism, I
No, I
wonder
shouldn't
if
have.
you, no, but I wonder if you see a relationship between your work and the work of Sol LeWitt.
Less than Cy Twombly,
Okay.
but somewhat, yeah.
Yeah. No, I look at that drawing in particular, and it to me, it evokes Sol LeWitt. Now, I know, Sol doesn't do his own drawings. He leaves instructions for how he wants drawings done. But when you said you were doing a walking drawing, I remember seeing the drawings that he required where it would be, I think, 7 people working together, and the tallest one would reach up as high as he could or she could and draw the line down, and the next person had to reach up as high as they could and draw. And it was that repetition of line, and each one was trying to repeat the line adjacent to the one they were drawing. And of course, it has that same kind of
It
quality.
would, yeah. Thanks. I didn't know about those.
We have one more question.
Sure.
I have a question. Could you tell a little bit about how, aging, physically getting old, affecting your work? As an older artist, certain things getting more difficult to do. Many repetitive movement, like the carpal tunnel or those things.
I have been really fortunate. None of the physical movement that I'm required to do for these is different, feels any different to me. In fact, not too much about my physical movement feels different, but a few things are beginning to. But nothing that and I feel really fortunate about that, but mine has to do more with, if I take a long car ride, it's just a little, getting up isn't quite the same, or if I drop down to my knees, my knees are a little sore, to get up. I think my knees might be my weak spot, because when I ran, that's when my knees kind of stopped my running, made it less fun, I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
But other than that, I'm lucky so far. You want to address that?
Oh, no, I'd rather not. No, I've been fortunate too in that somewhere along the line, I took a stitching workshop with the artist named Ilse Avix, who's in Colorado, and she told me about finger cots, which are like condoms for your fingers, and they help you grip a needle so that when you're sewing, you're not having to squeeze that needle, that shiny, slippery needle, so hard to pull it through, either fabric or paper. So I'm always wearing those. And the other advantage is that if I'm handling the paper, I put them on my thumb and first 3 fingers, so I'm also not getting the oil from my hands on the paper. And I think if I were working with oil pastels now, I always like to use my finger in oil pastels. I would probably wear them as well.
One more thing about that, just about your physical self. The woman back there asked about advice for young people. Another piece of advice for young people and your physical self. Take care of it. If you're a maker, whatever kind of maker you are, you're doing something over and over. I knew a woman that was a weaver on a loom. One of her legs developed a much larger muscle than the other because she used that leg to treadle. If you're a person who works in the metal shop and you're forging, and it affects your muscles, it affects your arm, and you'll need to take care of it, whether it's stretching or there are places like Penland and Haystack. There are these wonderful camps, I call them camps, but they're schools, craft schools that people go to. And if you go to those, certainly if you go to Penland, there's always a movement instructor there for every session, whether it's Tai Chi or yoga or I can't think of whatever. but there's always some kind of movement instructor there, and that's why they have them there, to help you kind of correct what's going on in your body, because most of us aren't ambidextrous, and we're putting more stress on one, uneven wear on our body. So as a young person, you might want to be aware of that and start, if you throw, you're hunched over maybe. So what do you lift your wheel? Do you do something to help compensate for or minimize the problems that you might physically have, 30 years, 40 years later, so that you can keep working in comfort? I saw a hand back there. Mahindi, hi.
I wanted to know,
He's a fabulous musician, by the way.
thank you. I wanted to know if you listen to a particular type of music that you create. Musicians in our studios and clubs and so on, we're surrounded by graphic art and so on. It kind of influences, the feeling and the mood. Is it the same for you? Is there a particular type of music that you listen to, you like to listen to?
I wish I could say yes. There is not, but there is music that I love. And I think somebody asked me about space, or somehow I talked about space. If there were, or if I could, a lot of music, a lot of visual artists make art that has to do with a certain kind of music or certain artist music. If I did, the only musician I think I could make music or make visual art to would be Thelonious Monk, because of the space. There's so much space in his music. And my sister owned 2 of his albums when I was a kid. And so they were the first 2 albums that I sort of commandeered from my sister, maybe the only 2. And I got them right away. I just got them. And, they weren't, well, I don't think any of his work was difficult. Some Coltrane stuff, I just sort of caught up to it 10, 15 years ago, the more out stuff. But Monk's work I always got, so yeah, his. Even though I don't necessarily play that when I'm working, I don't necessarily play music when I'm working. But yeah, you're
But
a
I
jazz
do.
person too.
Yeah. I usually listen to jazz, but sometimes if I'm working on a piece and I need to really need some quiet space, then I'll listen to something a little softer, a little easier. And then if I'm really, really having to get something done, I put on Powakatsi, because that somehow just drives me along. Powakatsi, Philip Glass. So that drives me along. And then sometimes I get tired of being in the studio alone, so I need to hear words, and I can't listen to books on tape because I would forget what I was doing. I will listen to vocalists. Then I'll listen to Dapsep Kings, or I'll listen to just different vocalists that I happen to have. But I have a whole variety. If Bob and I go to a performance and they're selling CDs, I'll buy the CDs and he never hears them again, because they go over to my studio. Oh wait, one more.
One more. We got time, right?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Can you talk a little bit about the absence of color in your work?
Yes, I think I can. I think. I've wondered about that myself. Years ago, I thought I should tackle it. The way that you should do things that you're afraid to do or that you don't already know how to do. But I don't feel that way anymore. I'm in love with the material of porcelain. And in fact, some of these, I've done some tests where I have glazed them. And it feels like a skin. It feels like, well, it is. Glaze is a skin. But it feels like something between, because the porcelain as it is here on these pieces is not the center of these works, for one thing. And again, I like this notion of restraint and a spot of color. a point of color. So unless I worked on these in another way, the only place, since they're about the line, the only place for me to introduce color would be in the line, to kind of keep the emphasis where I'm looking for it to be. But that might be kind of an interesting thing to do. And I might be able to do that because the line is so fine that would just be a small amount of color. So that would be okay, right? But I guess maybe back to a more serious response to that, as I think color is a big deal. Color is really complicated. And maybe if I had kind of been working at this intensity all those years, I'd have been able to figure it out. But until I can, I mean, I think about color. My training in color was kind of formal. You learned about shades and tints and different color schemes and what dulled what. And so I see it as an incredible universe, that if you begin to change, and if you change one thing, you've changed everything else. And so you've got to consider all the other colors. So maybe I just have made it this huge thing in my head. But until I'm ready to sort of tackle it and kind of understand and figure out how color behaves, I figure I don't have time to get into color. And the other reason that I think color is really complex is because of weaving. Because if you think about the threads going over and under each other, they're mixing. You're mixing color. And that is huge. It has to do with how much of the warp is showing, how much of the weft is showing, which will affect how much of the color is showing. And so I think of color mixing as being a really big universe that requires a lot of understanding that you only gain by doing the work. Which is another interesting thing that Teresita Fernandez says is the majority of the work you do, the work of the work you do isn't seen. I mean, something like that. I'm probably mangling it, but people see the tip of the iceberg, and all this is the work that you did to get this here. And I say that to students, expect to do, it's another piece of advice, expect to do way more work, throw away way more work than you keep. And I think that's a big mental hurdle for young people, most young people. I mean, maybe they're different now than they were when I was a young person. But, that notion that more's not going to be
better.
It's not even that. It's just you've got to learn so much. You've got to figure out a lot of stuff that just never gets shown. It shows up in what you've done, but it's not, what other people are going to see. That's what the comment was that the essence of the quote that I mangled is that, the most of the work that you do is not going to be seen by other people, but you'll know it. And you have to set your own level of integrity. You have to decide whether, you can put all kinds of stuff out there and most people won't challenge it, but you've got to decide whether it's up to par.
Well, we just want to thank Elizabeth and Dolores, all of you for your
Thank
questions.
you.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.